sexiest topic to talk about today because we're talking about distribution agreements, but hopefully you'll learn a couple of things. So why are distribution agreements necessary? Well, they're necessary to protect your brand. So how do you go about creating a distributor relationship? Well, first you want to do is you want to identify a distributor, schedule a meeting, negotiate your deal terms, and then hopefully execute a distribution agreement. So today what we're going to do is talk about some deal terms. So I'm going to talk about 10 deal points to negotiate with your wholesaler. I'm going to use wholesaler and distributor interchangeably today. So the first thing we have are your products. So what products do you want to sell into the market, and what are they? So you're going to have a brand, you're going to have different sizes, and say you have one particular product. Say I have Donna's Vodka. So I'm going to sell that into the marketplace. Well, I talk to the wholesaler, say this is what I'd like to distribute, these are the sizes. Now what happens down the road when you have line extensions or new products that come on board? So say I have my Donna's Vodka, I want to create Donna's Gin, maybe a bourbon, maybe I want to go into red wine, maybe I like beer. So what happens with that distributor? Do they automatically get those products, or do I give them to somebody else? Same thing with line extensions. So if I have Donna's Bourbon, so I have straight bourbon, now what if I want a smoky, peaty, bacony flavored bourbon? Well, that would be a line extension if it was under Donna's Bourbon. So does that distributor get my line extensions? Well, it's something that you would like to talk about. Now, if it's a line extension, the natural course would be that distributor would go with those brand extensions or the line extensions. But if you go into other markets, such as beer, maybe that wholesaler doesn't sell beer. Maybe they're not the right distributor to sell that product. So if you're looking for future growth, you may want to consider what your options are for the future and maybe decide that if you go into a different line, like I said, beer or wine, if I'm a distilled spirits producer, that maybe you can save that and go with a different distributor. However, your distributor will probably want the right of first refusal. Now, what does that mean? Right of first refusal means that they have the option to take on those line extensions or new products. So if I bring on, say, a sparkling wine, they may say, okay, you know what, I don't really particularly like that brand, or I don't sell in those channels, so you can go to a different distributor. But again, something that you would like to think about and talk about with your distributor. So now we get into the territory. Where are you going to sell? So I think some of the previous speakers talked about you may be in one market, you may not go nationally, you may start off maybe in New York, but you may only want to be in Metro New York, you may not want to be in upstate New York. So who is going to distribute your product in those areas? Well, you may have one distributor, say you want to go New York State completely. You may have one distributor in Metro, but you may have a different distributor in upstate New York. So again, you want to make sure that you identify those areas so if you have multiple distributors, they're not competing with one another. Now, many people may have heard of exclusivity. A distributor may say, well, if I'm going to represent your brand, I want the exclusive rights to sell that brand, whether it's in a state, a county, or a broader territory. So you want to discuss whether or not that's the right market or the right move for you. And then lastly, suppliers often forget if they're a winery or a distillery that they can actually sell products themselves. You may have a visitor center, and in that visitor center, you're selling products to the customers that come on board or come to see you. So now what happens if you make a sale? Does that profit go to your wholesaler? So if you do have that ability to sell directly to the consumers, you may want to consider having that discussion with your wholesaler so there's no confusion. Pricing and payment terms, I think, are pretty straightforward. You are going to set your prices to your distributor, and one of the things that you may want to consider is how often you can change those prices. So if there's inflation or if there is an increase in your cost of goods, how many times can you make those changes and have that effectuated in the marketplace? Sometimes suppliers may think, well, I have an increase in the cost of my goods, so I'm going to increase my price to the distributor, and then it's just going to go down the line. Well, that's not necessarily the case. It depends on where you're distributing, if you can make those changes in the state, how frequently you can do that, and also there's a lag time. So just because you want to make a change maybe in the next month, that may not actually occur because in a particular state, maybe it takes 3 months. And then lastly, how and when payments are made. You would like to make sure that you're clear as to how that will be done. Now, roles and responsibilities seems pretty straightforward. You're a supplier, you're bringing in products, you're hiring a wholesaler, they have a wholesale team, they have salespeople that are going to go out and market your product. So, what are you supposed to do? Well, as a supplier, generally you'll have a marketing plan, and then you are going to discuss that with your distributor, and hopefully that you agree on that plan, and then you'll move forward and sell the products along. But when you call on accounts, the wholesalers have a sales team. That's generally why you want to go with them. And they're going to go out and try to sell your product in a vast area. Now, suppliers oftentimes have their own sales team and also brand ambassadors. So they go out to market and try to sell the products as well. But what you want to do is make sure that you are not duplicating efforts. I've seen many situations where you have the sales teams of both companies, the wholesaler and the supplier, and what happens is they go to the same accounts. Well, that's not what you want to do. Obviously, you want to divide and conquer and be able to get in as many accounts as possible. So as long as you're clear as to who is responsible for what, you'll definitely have greater success. Now, inventory levels are something that people probably don't think about that often. You think, okay, we have a product, we're going to sell it, my wholesaler is going to have a certain level of inventory, and then it's just going to go through the supply chain. Well, if your product takes off, as we hope they all do, there's great demand for it, what happens? How much inventory is your wholesaler going to have? Are they going to maintain 30 days, 60 days, 90 days? What number would that be? Because you want to make sure when that demand happens that they have the ability to sell through. On the flip side, the supplier has the responsibility of being to maintain a level of inventory. So if you're producing, you want to make sure you have the production to meet the demand of the wholesaler, to meet the demand in the marketplace. So again, a conversation to be had on both sides of how much inventory you'll have. And then lastly, reporting. The wholesalers have access to a lot of different data points. Some of it they generate on their own, some of it may be purchased. And as a supplier coming in, you may have the ability to have access to most of those reports. So it's important to actually talk to your wholesalers and find out what data they have available, what you can get, and how often you'll receive it. Because again, that gives you greater visibility as to how your product is tracking through the supply chain. So now we're on to the term of the agreement. Pretty straightforward. The term of agreement, are you going to be with that wholesaler for a year, 3 years, 5 years? Suppliers tend to want to have shorter term agreements, whereas the wholesaler will generally want to have a longer term agreement. But regardless, you can set up whatever the term is going to be, whatever the length. How is it going to end? You can have a set expiration date. So if I go into an agreement and it is a 1-year term, well, it may start on January 1st, and then it may expire automatically on December 31st. And at that point in time, you can go and either continue to work together or you can go your separate ways. On the flip side, you can have automatic renewal. So if, again, say I have a 3-year term agreement, and if I don't give notice or the wholesaler doesn't provide me with notice, December 31st, it will automatically roll over for another 3 years or another term if you decide to change that. So in such case, it just continually turns over, and generally wholesalers would prefer to do it this way because then you don't have to think about what's happening next and renegotiate your terms. So now that you have an agreement, you have your term, you're all set up, how do you get out of the agreement? So again, if you have your natural expiration, that's one thing, but what if you want to get out earlier? Well, generally there are 2 ways you can do that. There is without cause, or sometimes it's called for convenience. So you may set up a notice period and say, okay, if you give me 60, 90 days notice to the other side, then you can get out of it. No harm, no foul. But if you terminate for cause, it's generally because there's a reason that you want to get out of this agreement. And what are those reasons? Well, sometimes you may have performance goals that are set up. You may say to your distributor, I'd like you to make minimum case goals of X during this period of time. And if they constantly do not meet those goals, well, then you may give them notice and then try to get out of it. There may be a breach of the agreement. There may be financial issues, say bankruptcy or inability to pay bills. Or there could be a change in control. Sometimes you may work with somebody because you like the management team, the ownership may be important to you. So what happens if there's a merger or somebody sells their shares and they're not running the company? You may not like the new management team, and you may have ability to get out if you put those provisions in your agreements. And lastly, most importantly, because we're a heavily regulated industry, if you lose your license, well, they can't sell your product. And while they're negotiating that problem, you do not want your product to be sitting and unable to move because they don't have a license to sell. So at the beginning, I was telling you that distribution agreements are set forth to protect your property or protect your brands. And intellectual property is a very big part of that. Most of you probably have registered your trademarks for your brands, and that's valuable. So when you're working with a wholesaler or distributor, or anybody in general, if you have trademarks, what you want to do is police your marks. It's very important to keep your trademarks intact. So you would work with your wholesalers and include in the distribution agreement a license to use it, generally be a non-exclusive license because you may work with one or multiple distributors. Identify the scope of use, so in this instance, it would be to market and you sell your products, and then also the duration. So if your agreement terminates or expires, you would want that right to use your trademarks to go along with it. So now, you have your agreement, everything worked out, and either expired or terminated. So again, this is a business. Just because the contract says you end in December 31st doesn't mean your business stops. So what happens if you have pending orders? If you're importing product from overseas, there could be an order on the water. What do you do with that order? Or there may be inventory sitting in the warehouse of your wholesaler that you just terminated for cause. And they may also have marketing and POS materials. So what do? Well, I would suggest what you do with that is you put a clause in there that says that you have the right to buy the inventory or the marketing materials from the existing wholesaler, or that your new wholesaler will be able to do that. And the reason why you do it is so you have your inventory in the supply chain. If you are working with a wholesaler and God forbid they are not selling your product and they've just been sitting on it, if you don't have a provision like that, if they're able to retain your inventory, well, they could take that inventory and just dump it in the market. And I don't mean they're doing it just maliciously, but they want to get rid of the product. They're not selling it for you anymore. And then you may flood the market with your product. Well, that's not good, because then who's going to go and buy your product, right? It's already flooded into the market. Or alternatively, what if your new wholesaler needs product because you weren't able to get enough inventory generated, or new product to sell because it was held up with the former wholesaler? Well, now you have no product to get into the marketplace, so then you're going to have a lag period. And if your product, you hope, is a hot brand, right, that they're really demanding it, you want to get it out there. So this is one of the things that you can avoid so you don't have a misstep. Now, franchise laws are a bit tricky. This is a whole nother topic, but I just want to touch upon it briefly. So we have franchise states in the country that once you start working with a wholesaler, you can't get out of them that relationship unless you have good cause. Now, previously we talked about terminating for good cause, but in franchise states it's a little different. Good cause isn't because you didn't meet the minimum case goals that you put in an agreement. It's not just even if you negotiate the terms, it's generally not good enough to get out of that franchise. It'll be dictated by the statutes of the particular state or the case law of that particular state. It's very hard to get out of. Sometimes people say that it's easier to get a divorce from your spouse than it is to divorce your distributor. In franchise states, this is really true. So the question what I would say is be very cautious if you're going to franchise states, that if you just willy-nilly appoint different distributors because a friend tells you, like, these are really good people, I trust them, or this is my brother-in-law, just give him a couple of cases or a couple of bottles to sell, you can sell one bottle and that creates a franchise. So you want to be very careful about doing this. I can tell you personally, working with a company that had a bunch of wines that they acquired. And they were all different different wineries, and over a period of time, they were just appointing different distributors. So they had one for this one for that one. Sometimes there was overlap, but there was no plan. So the company decided that they wanted to consolidate and really have a distribution plan for their wine. Well, when they looked at it, they said, okay, let's consolidate our wholesalers. This way we can really get out to market. And then they realized, looking at it, there was no way they could do it because you couldn't get it just with one wholesaler that was regional or national because it was all pocketed all over the place. So again, best efforts, you try it, and the only way to get out was to either purchase the rights, which is very expensive, so you get into your liquidated damages, or if the distributors decide to swap. So we were lucky in some instances they swapped, and in others there had to be a payment, but again, it's never a perfect situation. So it's just something to be leery of moving forward. And then last, a lawyer's dream, dispute resolution. So when you first meet with your potential partner, wholesaler, again, everything is great, right? You all have the best intentions. You want to go sell product. Everybody wants to be able to make money and have a long-term relationship. Unfortunately, this doesn't always happen. So what we try to do is, of course, negotiate between the owners. So you have the owners of the wholesaler, maybe the owners of the supplier, and try to work it out. Unfortunately, that does not always work. So there are generally three forms that you can use for dispute resolution: mediation, arbitration, and litigation. Now, mediation, I would say, is the best method to use because if you work with a mediator, you can get somebody who is very familiar with the industry. And again, we have a quirky little industry, so not everybody understands what we do. Arbitration, and it's probably the least costly out of the three alternatives. Arbitration is middle of the road. Again, it's usually a little faster than litigation, less expensive, and you could get a good turnout that way. And then lastly, it's litigation. I mean, litigation, everybody knows. You read about cases that are locked up in the courts for years. It's very, very expensive, and it's really not friendly to the business owners. It takes long to get a resolution, and by the time you do it, they may not even understand your industry, and it may be the wrong resolution for you. So again, hopefully I was able to highlight some key provisions to think about, talk about with your potential wholesalers. And if you have any questions, I will be around later, and hopefully I'll talk to you then. So thank you very much.